In the autumn of 1978, a woman named Eleanor Voss sat in a hospital bed in Albuquerque, New Mexico, dying of a disease that had already taken most of what she used to be, and she asked her niece to bring her a cigar box from the back of a closet in a house that woman would never see again. Inside that box were 6 small strips of film, each no larger than a fingernail, each cut so precisely along the edge of a photographic frame that whatever had once been captured in the center of that frame was gone entirely. Not damaged, not faded, removed. What remained was the border. The sprocket holes, the manufacturer's code stamped into the film stock at the factory before it was ever loaded into a camera. Eleanor did not explain what the strips were from. She said only one sentence to her niece, a young woman named Carol Ann Reyes, before her strength gave out for the evening. She said, "Keep these, and never let anyone tell you the numbers on them don't mean anything." Then she closed her eyes, and the conversation, whatever it might have become, ended there. Carol Ann Reyes kept that cigar box for 26 years before she showed it to anyone outside her family. This is, according to what Reyes has since told researchers, the story her aunt never fully told her, reconstructed instead from fragments from a personnel record that goes strangely quiet at a specific point in 1947, from a base inventory ledger that does not account for a roll of film that should exist, and from 6 pieces of cut celluloid that carry a manufacturing code no one has been able to definitively place. What follows is not a claim that something extraordinary was photographed at Kirtland Air Force Base in the autumn of 1947. It is an account of what happened to a woman who may have developed film that was never supposed to exist in any accessible form, and what happened to the evidence of that afternoon in the decades since. According to available records, Eleanor Voss was 24 years old in 1947, employed as a photographic laboratory technician assigned to the base photo section at Kirtland Air Force Base outside Albuquerque, roughly 200 miles from the debris field that would make Roswell a permanent word in the American vocabulary. Her job, by all accounts mundane, involved developing routine reconnaissance film, personnel identification photographs, and documentation for engineering reports. It was not, on paper, a position that would place her anywhere near a historical mystery. That is, perhaps exactly why it did. Reyes says her aunt rarely spoke about her military service at all, which in itself was not unusual for a woman of that generation, but what she does remember, pieced together from a handful of guarded conversations across 3 decades, centers on a single afternoon in October of 1947. Eleanor told her, more than once but always briefly, that a superior officer she did not name walked into the photo lab and handed her a canister of exposed film. There was no requisition form. There was no case number written on the canister, which according to standard Army Air Force's documentation procedures of that period, should have accompanied any film sent for development, especially anything connected to base operations. The instruction, Eleanor said, was verbal. Develop this. Do not log it. Bring me the negatives directly when you are finished, she said. The officer stood in the doorway the entire time she worked, which she found strange, because standard procedure did not call for an officer to remain present during routine development, and this was, she insisted, anything but routine. What exactly was on that film, Eleanor never described to her niece in any specific visual terms. She used the word unusual. She used the phrase, not like anything I had developed before. When Reyes, as an adult, finally pressed her aunt directly during one of their last conversations, asking what she meant by unusual, Eleanor reportedly said only this: "I am not going to describe it to you, because if I describe it, you will spend the rest of your life trying to find it, and there is nothing left to find." That statement, if accurately remembered, is worth sitting with for a moment, because it suggests something particular. Not that nothing happened, that whatever happened was deliberately made unfindable. According to Reyes, her aunt completed the development that afternoon, produced a set of negatives, and handed them to the waiting officer as instructed. What she did not hand over, according to the story passed down through the family, were 6 small strips cut from the extreme edges of the film roll, the leader and trailer sections that typically contain no photographic image at all, only the manufacturer's identifying code burned into the film stock during production. Eleanor kept these. Whether this was an act of quiet defiance, an act of self-protection, or simply the reflexive habit of a careful technician who did not want to hand over an entire roll without retaining some documentation of what she had processed, is something no one can say with certainty. What can be said is that those 6 strips survived for more than 30 years, hidden, according to Reyes, first in a sewing kit and later in that cigar box, moved from residence to residence, as Eleanor's life continued along its otherwise unremarkable course. Here is where the account moves from family testimony into something that can, at least partially, be checked against documentary evidence, and here is where the deeper investigation begins to strain against the official record in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Eleanor Voss's military personnel file, portions of which Reyes was able to obtain through a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 1996, shows a woman whose service record is, up until a certain point, entirely conventional, routine performance evaluations, standard leave requests, nothing that would draw attention. Then, beginning in the first week of November 1947, weeks after the date her aunt associated with the mystery canister, the file goes quiet in a specific and unusual way. There is a gap of 6 weeks in which no evaluation reports, no duty assignments, and no correspondence of any kind appear in her record, a gap that her commanding officer's own annual summary for that period does not explain, noting only, in a single terse line, that Airman Voss had been temporarily reassigned to special duties. Special duties, not further specified. Reyes has spent years trying to determine what those special duties were. She has found nothing. This raises an obvious question. What kind of duty assignment produces 6 weeks of complete documentary silence in an otherwise routine personnel file, and why would a photographic laboratory technician, whose ordinary work was itself already classified as routine and low sensitivity, require special duties significant enough to erase 6 weeks from the official record entirely? The photographic supply ledger for Kirtland Air Force Base, portions of which were declassified and transferred to the National Archives in the early 1990s, offers a second thread, and it is here that the investigation becomes genuinely strange. Standard procedure at Army Air Force's photographic facilities in this period required that every roll of film checked out for development be logged by roll number, cross-referenced against a requisition form, and accounted for upon completion, whether the resulting negatives were filed, transferred, or destroyed. The ledger for October 1947 shows 14 rolls processed by the Kirtland photo section that month. 13 of them cross-reference cleanly to requisition forms still present in the base's surviving records. The 14th does not. There is a roll number recorded, but the requisition field beside it is blank, and the technician's initials beside that entry, according to Reyes and independently confirmed by a researcher named Louis Fenwick, who has spent over a decade cataloging Kirtland-adjacent testimonies for a private archive in Santa Fe, appear to match the signature style found elsewhere in Eleanor Voss's personnel file. A blank requisition field is not, on its own, remarkable. Clerical gaps existed throughout wartime and post-war military bureaucracy, but a blank requisition field connected to a roll processed by a technician whose own record goes silent for 6 weeks immediately afterward is the kind of detail that, once you notice it, is difficult to stop noticing. What happened to the negatives Eleanor Voss developed that afternoon, according to available records, is unknown. What happened to the 6 edge strips she kept is, at least partially documented, because in 2004, 26 years after her aunt's death, Carol Ann Reyes brought the cigar box to a private film collector and preservation specialist based in Tucson, a man who had spent much of his career authenticating vintage photographic materials for museums and archives, and who agreed to examine the strips on the condition that his professional assessment, not his personal speculation, would be what Reyes shared publicly. According to that assessment, which Reyes has since made available to researchers, the emulsion layer on the 6 strips was consistent in general chemistry with photographic film manufactured in the mid to late 1940s, which supported the strips being authentic artifacts of that era, rather than a later fabrication. But the assessment also noted something the collector described as an inconsistency he could not fully explain. The manufacturer's edge code, a series of small geometric symbols and numerals that film companies of that period stamped onto the leader and trailer sections to identify batch, emulsion type, and production date, did not match any coding system he was familiar with from major American film manufacturers operating in 1947. He noted that the general format resembled Eastman Kodak's contemporary batch coding conventions closely enough that the film was almost certainly produced domestically, but that the specific symbol set appeared to belong to what he called, in his written notes, a specialized or limited production run, the kind of film stock manufactured for a specific institutional client, rather than sold on the open commercial market. Reyes took this finding further in the years that followed, contacting Eastman Kodak's corporate historical archive directly in an attempt to identify the code. According to correspondence Reyes has shared with researchers, a Kodak archival representative responded in 1997, stating that the coding format described did not correspond to any standard Kodak commercial or military contract batch system documented in the company's surviving production records for that period, and suggested the film may have originated from a specialized government contract for which Kodak's own historical archive held no accessible documentation. This is, it must be said clearly, not confirmation of anything extraordinary. Specialized government photographic contracts existed throughout the post-war period for a wide range of conventional purposes, including aerial reconnaissance, weapons testing documentation, and classified engineering projects entirely unrelated to unexplained aerial phenomena. But it does mean that a woman who developed an unlogged roll of film under verbal orders, whose personnel record goes silent for 6 weeks immediately afterward, kept for the rest of her life 6 small pieces of that film, bearing a coding system that a major American film manufacturer's own archive could not identify decades later. Each of these facts, in isolation, admits of an ordinary explanation. Their accumulation is what makes the story difficult to set aside. There is a third thread, and it is the one that Louis Fenwick, the Santa Fe researcher, considers the most significant, though he is careful, in his own published notes, to describe it as suggestive rather than conclusive. In the course of cataloging Kirtland-adjacent testimonies, Fenwick located 2 separate personnel transfer documents, both dated within the same 10-day window in November 1947, both referencing what is described only as special transport duty, and both signed by officers whose names do not appear elsewhere in the surviving Kirtland administrative record for that period. One of these documents concerns a motor pool sergeant. The other concerns a supply officer. Neither document specifies a destination, a cargo manifest, or a purpose. Fenwick has been unable to determine whether either man is still alive or whether either transport had any connection whatsoever to Eleanor Voss or to the unlogged roll of film she developed. What he has determined is that special transport orders lacking a stated destination were, according to 2 retired Army records administrators he interviewed for his research, unusual even by the standards of post-war military bureaucracy, which frequently obscured routine logistics behind vague language, but rarely obscured logistics this completely. Vague language is one thing, the complete absence of a destination field is another. Fenwick's working theory, which he presents explicitly as theory and not established fact, is that whatever Eleanor Voss photographed that October afternoon in 1947 required not only the destruction or removal of the primary negatives, but a coordinated set of personnel movements in the weeks that followed, movements deliberately structured to leave no traceable connection between the people involved and whatever was being moved. What was Eleanor Voss's life like after that autumn? According to Reyes, entirely unremarkable, which is itself, in the context of this story, a striking detail. She completed her service, was honorably discharged in 1949, married a construction supervisor named Harold Voss in 1951, raised two children, and worked for over 2 decades as a bookkeeper for a hardware distribution company in Albuquerque. She did not, so far as her family has been able to determine, ever discuss the events of October 1947 with anyone outside her immediate family, and even within her family. The subject surfaced only rarely, always briefly, and always in the same guarded tone her niece would later come to recognize as the specific sound of a door being deliberately left shut. She did not attend any conferences related to unexplained aerial phenomena. She did not correspond with researchers. She published nothing. She left behind no diary that addresses the subject directly. The only artifact she left behind that speaks to that afternoon at all is a cigar box containing 6 pieces of cut film and a single sentence delivered from a hospital bed in the final weeks of her life. There is a pattern here worth naming plainly, because it recurs throughout accounts of this kind gathered from this period. The witnesses who eventually speak, whether after decades of silence or, as in Eleanor's case, only at the very end and only in fragments, are rarely people who sought attention, built careers around their testimony, or showed any prior inclination toward this subject matter. They are bookkeepers. They are technicians. They are people whose entire adult lives were organized around ordinary, verifiable, unremarkable work, which is precisely what makes the anomaly of their single extraordinary afternoon so difficult to simply file away. Consider what we can say with reasonable confidence, and consider it plainly, because intellectual honesty requires holding these facts separately from the larger questions they raise. We know, from a Freedom of Information Act disclosure, that Eleanor Voss's personnel file contains an unexplained 6-week gap beginning in early November 1947. We know, from a declassified base supply ledger, that one roll of film processed by the Kirtland photo section in October 1947 lacks the requisition documentation that 13 other rolls processed that same month possess. We know that a private film preservation specialist examined 6 physical strips of film in 2004 and found their general chemistry consistent with mid-1940s manufacture, but their edge coating inconsistent with any documented commercial system, a finding a Kodak archival representative was unable to resolve in 1997. We know that 2 personnel transfer documents from the same narrow window in November 1947 lack destination information in a manner 2 records administrators considered unusual. What we do not know, and what no researcher including Fenwick claims to know, is what was actually contained in the images Eleanor Voss developed that afternoon. We do not know whether the unlogged roll and the special duties gap and the destination-less transfers are genuinely connected events or a coincidental cluster of ordinary post-war military disorganization that has taken on significance only in retrospect, the way any sufficiently examined bureaucracy will eventually yield anomalies if you look closely enough for long enough. This distinction matters, and it is worth resisting the temptation to collapse it. And yet there is the sentence, "If I describe it, you will spend the rest of your life trying to find it, and there is nothing left to find." A woman facing death, with every incentive at that point to simply say whatever she had been carrying for 31 years, chose instead to describe the boundary of what she would not say, rather than crossing it. That choice, that specific and deliberate act of restraint even at the very end, is not something easily explained by fatigue, medication, or the ordinary confusions that sometimes accompany a difficult final illness. According to the hospice nurse who was present that week, whom Reyes located and interviewed in 2011, Eleanor was lucid throughout the final conversation, aware of what she was saying, and appeared, in the nurse's words, more at peace after saying it than she had been in the preceding days. What does it mean to find peace not in disclosure, but in the careful articulation of a permanent absence? Reyes has asked herself this question for over 2 decades, and she has not arrived at an answer she considers satisfying. The 6 strips of film remain in Carol Ann Reyes's possession. They have been examined once, by one specialist, under conditions that did not include the kind of multi-institutional forensic analysis that might resolve the edge code question definitively. Reyes has, according to her own statements, resisted further destructive testing out of a concern that any additional cutting or chemical analysis required to identify the coding system conclusively would consume what little physical evidence remains of her aunt's afternoon in October 1947. This means the central physical artifact in this story exists in a kind of permanent limbo, preserved but unresolved, a set of 6 small pieces of film that prove a roll of unusual film stock passed through a specific woman's hands on a specific base in a specific season, without proving anything at all about what that film once showed. The negatives themselves, whatever they contained, have never surfaced. No print, no contact sheet, no laboratory record has ever emerged in any archive, public or private, connected to this event. What was developed that afternoon, if this account is accurate in its broad outline, exists now only as a shape defined by everything around it. A silent personnel file, a blank requisition line, a coding system no manufacturer's own historian could place, 2 transport orders with nowhere written down for them to go. We do not know what Eleanor Voss saw in the developing tray that October afternoon in 1947. We do not know whether the officer standing in her doorway was there to observe her competence or to ensure her silence. We do not know where the negatives went after she handed them over, or whether they still exist in some archive we will never be permitted to see, or whether they were destroyed the same week, in which case the 6 strips in that cigar box are not merely evidence of an unusual afternoon, but the last physical fragment, however marginal, of whatever briefly passed through a small photographic laboratory outside Albuquerque. We do not know why a woman who otherwise lived a life of complete conventionality chose, at the very last possible moment available to her, to speak only of the shape of her silence rather than its contents. What we are left with, in the end, is not a photograph. It is the space where a photograph used to be, cut cleanly along its own edges, and kept, deliberately, for 31 years, by a woman who understood, better than anyone who has investigated this case since, exactly how much could be said, and exactly where the saying had to stop.